We're going to start off by finding a spot to place the sensors, and we'll have another video showing some of the strategy behind where in the field to place it, but you don't want to have them too close together, but you don't want them too far apart, so you'll kind of see about the spacing that I do here in the video. All the wires need to be able to reach the integration device, but if you have them too close together, they can possibly interfere with each other, and you just don't want to have to try to work around one sensor when placing another one. So give them a little bit of room there. I like to start by placing the 3-foot sensor, the deepest one, and this needs to go closest to the integration device so that the cables are best used, because this is going to have a little bit shorter cable than the other ones. So one thing that I do is on my backsaver probe, I have measured off the length using a tape measure and figured out where that little internal mechanism that you can see on the inside, where that is when it's at the correct length. So rather than having to pull that out of the ground and use a tape measure to figure out how deep I've gone, I can just look down there where I've there's a couple of dirty old pieces of tape that you can see on my backsaver probe here. And I use that to see how deep I'm actually going. It's important, very important, to make the hole deep enough, and I usually give just a couple inches extra space, but you don't want to make a big giant core that's down deeper than it needs to be, or else you can have some issues with that as well. So just give it a little bit of extra room in case some dirt falls in there. When you're putting the watermark sensor in the hole, the neater job that you do, the better your results are going to be and the better the data is going to be. So I like to get it started by hand, and I push it as far as I comfortably can without having to meet too much resistance and bend the pipe around. And as soon as it really becomes difficult at all to push down or has a fair amount of resistance, I'll switch over to using the probe pushing device. And so using that, this might be a little unfamiliar, a new device for most of you to see here, but basically you just move this foot peg around and it sandwiches the CPVC pipe that the watermark is attached to. It sandwiches it in there, and when you push down with your foot, it squeezes it and gives you some leverage and lets you use your foot to push it down rather than your hands, and it kind of ratchets up the pipe as you go, and so that way you're always pushing towards just a few inches above the ground, and so you're not wiggling that pipe around too much, and it's a lot easier on your wrist. So I would recommend using it if at all possible. Once you have pushed the 3-foot sensor down to the line that's marked on the tube that tells you how deep you need to push it down, then you can move on to the next one. And for the 2-foot, it's the same way. I've made a 2-foot mark on my backsaver probe as well as the 3-foot mark, so that way I know that I'm making a hole that's just a little bit deeper than the watermark sensor is going to be placed. And I use the probe pusher to push the watermark sensor down into the ground again. And I'm just careful not to step on any plants around me. I'm careful not to try to compact the soil in the row any more than I have to. When I'm placing these, I usually start a few inches outside of the row and angle them slightly in towards the row. I know some people in some situations might need to place the moisture sensor directly in the row in line with the corn or the beans. And sometimes you might even place it actually farther away from the row if there's drip tape. And I've usually found that placing it in between the drip tape and the crop is usually the best way to monitor that, but different people have different perspectives on that. When it comes to the temperature sensor, you're going to want to place that about 10 inches down. So try not to get that too shallow, or else it's going to fluctuate too much, and if you put it too deep, it's going to read a little bit too cool. So you want that right about 10 inches is usually what we try to get it at. Now I've got all of my sensors placed. I've got my 4 watermarks, the 6, 12, 24, and 36-inch sensors. I've got the temperature sensor in the ground, and something that's very important that you don't want to skip is going back to those. You can either do this while you're placing them, or I like to kind of wait and do it at the end. and make sure that there's a good seal between the soil and the moisture probe, the tube. And so I like to use this tool here that I can kind of dig at the ground if the ground is hard, and I can crumble up some dirt. This works a lot better if it's a little bit moist, and you can dig down and grab some moist dirt and pack it in around the top of the sensor. It doesn't have to be too crazy. You're not going to pour concrete here or anything, but you do want that to be nice and firm. And if there's a little pile of soil, kind of a little pyramid or pile of soil around the sensor, that will help the water run away rather than pooling up and running down the sensor. If you notice that your 3-foot sensor is spiking when it rains, and it's spiking as quickly as your upper sensors are, then chances are water is actually running down that tube, and that's something that we want to avoid. Now for cable management, what I found works pretty well is to run the cords horizontally just straight over to the tube that the integration device is on. And then I attach them at the base and then run them up the tube. And that way when the integration device itself moves in the wind or just kind of shifts around, it's not going to pull on those wires. If I ran them straight up to the box, and then the wind would catch that and it would tug on that and it would loosen up the sensors, it could damage the wires. So I like to run it along the ground. If it's laying directly on the ground, that can tend to cause rodents to chew on it more. Some fields are just going to have more issues with rodents than others. And as you'll see, I kind of untangle the cables, I run them over, and then I wrap it underneath and up. And at that point where I wrap it under and up, I attach a zip tie. And it doesn't have to be super tight. You don't want it. You don't want to be like pulling it really tight. You just want it to be up off the ground. And with that zip tie, then I take all my excess cable and I wrap it up in a coil up near the top, near the box. And I just want to make sure that as I'm wrapping up that coil, that I leave enough length of the wire to plug it into the box. And if you mess this up, you can always pull the strand out a little bit more. It doesn't have to be perfect, but the neater and tidier you are at this point, when you go back out to remove everything from the field and put everything away, it's actually going to save you some time in the long run. One thing that is important is the orientation of the box, the direction that it's facing. And you want the face of it that has the logo, you want that to be facing towards where the gateway is. So that's something that you should be able to look up on the placement map that you have access to. And a lot of cases, it's going to be in the pivot in the field that you're in, but in some cases it might be on a grain bin or on some other building nearby. So just need to be aware of that and try to aim the face of that box towards where the gateway is, and that'll just ensure that it gets the best reception that way. So when you plug in the wires, they're just friction fit and they should go in fairly easily. You don't need to jam them in too hard. You can just push them in far enough. You should feel a little bit of resistance when they're getting clamped onto. And if you give them kind of a little bit of a pull, you'll be able to tell that you can't pull them out without pushing on the tab. And that'll tell you that they're in there securely. When you're putting the wires into the box, you want to make sure that you start with the shallowest sensor on the left, labeled 1, and go all the way to the deepest sensor on the right, labeled 4. And you want to make sure that they're in that order from shallowest to deepest. If some of the wires are frayed or coming apart or just even really dirty, a lot of times what I find is it's easier to just cut and redo the end of the wire rather than try to get it all twisted up and cleaned up and everything like that. So when you're ready to put the wires in the box, what I would do is just use your wire strippers to cut the wire and then to get a nice clean end on it there and then put it in the box. Now that we have everything all hooked up and ready to go, there's one last step that's going to turn the box on, and that's to put the batteries in. So we want to put in 2 AA batteries, and specifically we want to use the lithium type batteries. They're not rechargeable, but they do last a lot longer, and they also don't leak like alkaline batteries can. So that would be the type that we'd want to go with, is with the lithium batteries. So once you put the batteries in, that's going to actually cause the box to do some special things. It's going to take a GPS reading of where it's at, and it's also going to send out an initial signal to the closest gateway, actually to any gateway that can listen. And so those things are going to happen at the time that the batteries are placed in. So you don't want to put the batteries in before you've walked out to the field or that sort of thing. Otherwise, it is going to mess up the installation process. And so make sure you wait until everything's hooked up to put the batteries in. And then if you look at the LED here on the box, that little blinking light, you'll see it blink through some different colors. That can be kind of confusing at first, but here's just kind of the general meaning that you need to know. Blue, when you see it blinking blue, that means that it's in the process of taking a GPS reading. So you should see that if you've moved the box and then put the batteries in it. So when you're doing that placement in the field, it should be blinking blue for at least several seconds. And it's in some cases it might even be a minute or two, depending on how good of a GPS signal it's able to get that day. So it should have that blinking blue. And then you'll also see, it might be kind of at the same time that it's blinking blue. It might be after it's done blinking blue. But you'll see it blink a magenta color, that kind of purplish violet color, that magenta. And then immediately after it lights up with magenta, it's either going to show red or green. So if it goes magenta green, as it is in the video here, then that means that it is getting a response from the gateway. So that's a good thing. If it goes magenta red, then that probably means that you either don't have a good enough signal at the place where you put the box, or there's something wrong with the gateway, or you might have put the soil station out for whatever reason before the gateways got put up. Hopefully this summer, all of the gateways should be in place before the soil stations go out. So if you see magenta red, that would be an indication that you probably need to call in and get some help for what's going on there. Because otherwise, if it's blinking magenta red and you leave the field, what you're going to find is, one, you're not going to be able to get any diagnostic information on the website. And if you leave the field, that box is never going to report in. So it's not going to be a successful installation. Okay, everything looks good with the lights. So I'm going to finish up the registration of this box to this field by just taking any QR code reader on the App Store, whether you've got iOS or Android. There's a variety of free QR code readers that'll work. I'm just going to snap a picture of that QR code and within the QR code reader app, and it's going to bring me to the website here. When you close the box, you want to make sure that you kind of hold the wires out of the way so that they don't get pinched, and you can kind of look under there when you close it, and there should be a little bit of a click to it when it closes so that it won't open again. And then the other thing I've done here is I've put on some flagging tape that will help make it more visible and make sure that if there is equipment in the field that it doesn't hit it. All right, so here's a in-depth look at the website and what you're going to see when you go to first check out and make sure that the device is working, and then also what you're going to see and what steps you'll need to do to actually assign the device to the correct grower and field. So when you scan the QR code of the device, and then it should take you straight to the page for that device. If not, try just scanning that QR code again after you're logged in, and it should bring you here. So what I'm seeing, this is kind of the top half of the page here, and I'm going to see some diagnostic information. Don't worry too much about those little charts and graphs in the middle there, but there's a couple things I want to draw your attention to. So these water droplets here, if everything is hooked up and they are reporting in correctly, those should be green. If they are red or if they are white, then either something isn't working right or you haven't finished setting them up. So before we move on, we will go ahead and check this out. So if you click this gear in the upper right here, it will bring you to this page. And here I can see that on this particular box, it actually doesn't have any of these hooked up because I'm getting these really big nonsense numbers. If the soil moisture sensors and the temperature sensor were hooked up correctly, I'd be seeing reasonable numbers for centibars, somewhere between 0 if it's wet and 200 if it's dry. I would be seeing the temperature in degrees Celsius for the temperature sensor. And since I'm seeing these other numbers here, that tells me that things aren't working correctly. So that's something to take note of. In this case, I also want to look at the depths and make sure they're right. And so In this case, I would actually change the temperature sensor down to 10 because that's where we generally like to put them. But to change them, you can just click on the little arrow, and then that will let you change the depth, and then you can hit save, and that'll save the depth. So going back to this screen, in this case, I would need to double check and make sure everything was actually hooked up right, because what I'm seeing here shows me that things aren't working. But let's pretend like they were, and let's look at the signal. There's a signal strength indicator, and that is giving me a green check mark and 3 out of 4 bars, and so that would be good to go. That's telling me the power, 3.4 volts, so things are okay there. The batteries are doing all right. If I scroll down the page, I'm going to see 2 more indicators. That's going to be the last time and date that it took its location, and if you click on that, it will actually launch the map application on your phone, or it should, to where you can then find the sensor after you've placed it, and you can also verify that it's in the right spot. This is just telling you the last time that it logged in and sent data at all. So what you'll find is when you first do the install, you'll probably have the same number for the time and date that it updated its location and sent the last information packet, but then that location will not be updating very frequently, whereas that little cloud icon will keep updating, should be updating on a very regular basis when you look at that. And if it's been a while, or if it's been too long since either of those have updated, they'll be red instead of green. So let's install it with the actual customer and field. So if you scroll back up to the top, you'll see that little hamburger menu at the upper right. I'm going to click on that. It's going to open up my menu to where I can click on customers. So I'm going to click customers. I'm going to start by just clicking Servitech. Then I'm going to click on the name of my farmer, and due to the ordering process that we're using, this should already be here. So don't go through and click add new customer. First, you should go down the list, and your customer should already be on this list. Then you can click the name of the field. Then what you want to do is click on the button that says add new device. And then it's going to bring up a list of recent devices that you've looked at, and it should be the one at the very top of the list. You can look at that ID number, look at the serial number, and double check just to make sure. And finally, once you've clicked on that, it's going to give you the option. You're going to see that same diagnostic screen you saw before, but now you're also going to have the option that says to install it in that field. So you'll want to click that, and then that device will be installed in that field. We've also verified that all the sensors are working correctly, and so at this point we can pack up and go. There are 4 things on the bag that are really important on the label that I just want to point out. So make sure that you never send in any soil samples that do not have these 4 things on every bag. So the first thing is the depth. You need to make sure that you're putting the correct part of the sample in the correct bag. So the top foot needs to go in the 0 to 12, second foot in the 12 to 24, and so on. So you'll have 3 bags for each location for the top, the second, and the third foot. The other thing is you need to make sure that you have the serial number of the device. So that is located on the inside. If you just open up the lid of the integration device, you'll see that serial number, and that it's really critical that that serial number is written down exactly the way it is on the device. If there's a typo or if it's not written down exactly that way, then it's not going to show up automatically on the website, and it's going to take a little bit more work on your part to get that all up and running. So you want to make sure that serial number is correct. And then the other 2 things that are good to have in case something goes wrong is the grower name. And you can even just put the last name of the grower there if you need to label a bunch of bags quickly. So the grower name, and then also the field name. So if something goes wrong with that serial number, or if something gets mixed up in the system, having the grower name and the field name should be enough to let us get everything back on track and get associated with the field and the location that it needs to be. While I'm taking the texture sample here with my probe, I'm paying attention to the marks that I've made to make sure that I know when I'm at my first foot, my second foot, and my third foot. Oftentimes I'll actually use not my Backsaver probe with the smaller bucket on it, but I'll actually use my just normal Oakfield probe that has a wider bucket because I don't have to make as many holes. So if the soil is not too difficult to probe, a lot of times I'll just use that other probe because I end up going faster. I don't have to make as many holes. With this narrow bucket, you'll find that you have to make quite a few cores to get the correct amount of soil in the bags. The bags do have a mark where you want to fill up the soil up to that line. And I know that seems like a lot, but the soil texture test requires a lot more soil. It requires somewhere around 10 times the amount of soil as things like our nutrient tests do. So if you put the amount of soil that would normally be acceptable for, say, a grid sample, if you put that much in the box or in the bag, it might actually not be enough to even complete a soil texture analysis at the lab. They have to use quite a bit when they do this analysis. So make sure that you err on the side of getting too much soil in there rather than too little. Obviously, you still need to be able to roll up the top of the bag and close it, but it is important to have plenty of soil in there and make sure you're getting the entire core, not dropping bits of it on the ground, or if you do, like I do from time to time, that you pick it up and make sure it all gets in the bag, and then just make sure that the appropriate depth is going in the correctly labeled bags. Now, something that you're going to find is necessary in a lot of fields that have corn, especially if the gateway is more than a quarter mile away, is that you are going to want to visit the field at some point and extend the length of the tube that the integration device is on. And so you can do that pretty simply just using the second piece of tubing that comes with it, as well as the connection piece, the little joiner piece here. And all you need to do is just take the integration device off the top, loosen up your cords. I cut a couple of these zip ties free, so I've got some more cord length to work with. Put the additional pipe on top there, and then just zip tie back down my excess cord length and just get everything, make sure that I get it pointed back in the direction of the gateway. So just like before, I want to make sure that I'm pointing the face of it, pointing the logo towards the gateway. And you're probably going to find that there is a little bit of wobble in the pipe, in the tube. It's not going to be completely rigid, but if you've done your cables correctly, you can move that around and test and see, and they shouldn't be putting any strain, shouldn't be pulling on the cables or pulling on the watermarks as it moves around. At the end of the year, extraction of the soil station is going to go a lot easier than if you have to pull out T-posts and everything. So the other thing that makes it a lot easier is the probe pushing device also can be used to pull the probes out, to pull out those watermarks. So what you want to do is just use that foot peg. Instead of using it as a foot peg, it goes down on the ground, and it's basically the fulcrum of a lever. It's kind of the pivot point of the lever. And so you'll put that, you'll hook that a little bit differently here, as you can see in the video, into the end of the longer rod, or the longer piece of metal. And then you'll just loop the chain around the top of the watermark. And I wouldn't worry too much about the strain that this puts on it, because so far in our testing, we haven't had any issues with this straining or breaking off that elbow at the top. So it actually works pretty good to just put that chain directly around it and then connect it on the little metal pegs on either side there, so that it holds it nice and snug. And then you just want to lift with the end of the longer piece here. And as you do, even though it's going to be easier to pull, you still want to be careful to not be leaning over and pulling with your back. You don't want to strain your back during this part of the process, but you should find it a lot, much easier than just pulling them out by hand. And you should find that you're not breaking things as much as if you were using a T-post for leverage or trying to use a different method of getting them out. Now, something to be careful when you're digging out the temperature sensor is not to just pull on the cord, because what you'll find is if you pull too hard, it'll either stretch or break, or just ruin that cord or the connection to the temperature sensor. So the best thing that you can do is just have a long, narrow trowel that you can use to loosen up that soil on top of it. Don't have to dig all the way down to it, but what you'll find is if you dig a ways down, it'll make it much easier to pull that out without having to put any strain or stress that's going to damage the temperature sensor itself. When I'm removing a soil station, I will try to take the batteries out of the integration device before I remove it from the field. That way it's not reporting back junk data and confusing the system that way, or making us think that it's still getting readings or still out in the field. It's best to take those batteries out at the time you extract it. I do leave the box plugged in though, so that way when I'm carrying it out of the field, if it falls off the end of the tube, the wires are going to keep it from getting lost. And I just use the wires from the watermarks to try to, as neatly as possible, wrap everything all up together. And that way I can remove it from the field and then take it home or back to the shed and get everything cleaned up and wrapped up and wiped off at that point.